Did we get you? Okay, great. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see everyone. I was just traveling a little bit the past few days to sunny San Francisco. It was quite nice, and I came back a little bit late last night and hit the pollen wall, if any of you have tree allergies. One of the things that happens with me in such a case is that my thoughts link together less, they're less sticky, which has some upsides and some downsides. And one of the downsides could be when you're trying to make some kind of a rational talk, which oftentimes I'm not too interested, but today I was hoping will be a little rational. But we'll see if I can keep the thoughts linked together in such a way. So the current political climate movements are disruptive. I'm choosing those words carefully. And since the inauguration of President Trump, since his election really, but since his inauguration, oftentimes in the assembly, there are questions that are not necessarily political questions, but questions that are coming out of people's trying to work with this political environment, and whether they're really specific, like about a particular political thing that's happening. The general unrest is also reverberating through, I think, everyone. And the anxiousness that comes from that, the fear, the anger, is real and important to talk about. I think oftentimes the way I try to respond to questions about that can give people the impression that politics and Buddhism have nothing to do with each other. And that's not actually what I want to say. I'm trying to point at something that's a little bit more subtle. Oftentimes, when that dichotomy of politics and Buddhism comes up, what I feel like is happening is politics has the upper hand. Politics becomes the defining characteristic of the dialogue, and we enter into, well, what's Buddhism going to do about this political situation? We've already framed it as a political question. And so oftentimes a response to that, I think from not just me, but many Buddhist teachers or leaders, will be to say, wait a minute. And the wait a minute sounds like we don't talk about politics around here. Or politics are off the table. Or if you feel uncomfortable about something that's happening politically, the spiritual thing to do is to get over it. But that's not the message. Right? The message is there's other parts that we need to look at if we're going to look at these issues. That the political side alone is not enough. And that as a religious institution, as a tradition, a wisdom tradition, I'll talk about a little bit about that today, or an intimate knowledge tradition, that there are answers that come from those traditions that are not located in the same place as a kind of political inquiry, or an inquiry about how do we try to mold power. And so I'm just going to jump into that a little bit today, and hopefully it knocks some things loose for us all, and maybe creates a little bit more sense of the possibility of how we might be able to not just turn from those kinds of subjects, but also make sure that we are caring for them equally. For those of you who've been studying the Lotus Sutra over the past couple months or longer, one of the central images in the Lotus Sutra is the burning house. This is a parable that the Buddha teaches about the nature of being human, and says that it's like we're in this burning house, but we don't know we're in the burning house. And that he gives this teaching about what it means to get out of the burning house. So aside from what the teaching is specifically, the image of the burning house, of everything being on fire, is really strong. And I believe GK will talk a little bit more about that next week. In the same sutra, in the verse of the lifespan, the Buddha makes this interesting statement. This is a sutra we chant every morning at the temple on weekdays, where he says that My Pure Land is completely present, pure and calm, and yet all see it as ravaged by fire. Saying that the Pure Land is right here. Everything's totally fine, and yet we all see it as ravaged by fire. That's how ignorant beings, i.e. you and me, okay? That's the way we see it. So another image of fire. In the Absorption in the Treasury of the Light, which is one of a text that I'm very fond of. It's not studied all that often. It's by Dogen Zenji, the founder of this school of Buddhism in Japan. His successor, whose name was Koun Ejo, which I share. The pronunciation of my name is the same as his. The characters are slightly different, so slightly different meaning. But I don't hold it against him. He wrote this text, and it's really a text about light. It's a text about faith, a text about concentration, about consciousness, illumination. And in this he quotes a famous ancestor, Unmen, who makes this statement. He says, "All people have a light, but when they look at it, they do not see it. So it is obscure. What is everyone's light?" No one in the assembly could reply. And Unmen says, "The communal hall, the Buddha shrine, the kitchen pantry, the mountain gate." And in his commentary on this koan, Koun Ejo says this. He says, "The light is everyone. Shakyamuni and Maitreya are its servants. What is not more in Buddhas or less in ordinary people is this spiritual light. It is the totality of existence, the great earth, one mass of fire." And so, if you've been around Buddha Eye very long, you've heard this. It is the totality of existence, the great earth, one mass of fire. This was a very important, when I read this was very important to me, and continues to be. And the reason I quote it here is because it's a place where this image of fire takes on a dual quality. The burning of everything is also the totality of everything. Impermanence, non-self, is the aliveness of the world. The thing that things change all the time, we oftentimes experience only as pain. But actually, it's how everything is alive. The totality of existence is not something inert. It is this completely one alive body, which is ablaze. And we experience a lot of difficulty in relationship to that blaze. But the blaze is also the illumination. In the Precious Mirror Samadhi, another text which we read often, it says, "Turning away and touching are both wrong, for it is like massive fire." The "it" here is a little bit extra. English is clunky. Turning away and touching are both wrong, like massive fire. The "it" that's being pointed to there is about truth, about the path, about practice. You can't grab onto it, but if you turn away, you're lost. And the reason I'm bringing up these images is because these images of flame and fire, that's also how they appear to us. Sometimes they're enlivening. Sometimes they help us cultivate a deeper insight. Sometimes they break something open. And sometimes all we can do is be afraid and try to protect ourselves and to protect those that we love and things that we know are important or believe are important. So the image of fire does not have to be contained in ravaged by. And this is part of what the Buddha is saying in the lifespan chapter, that that we're contained in an understanding of fire as being ravished. That's our inclination. But that we don't have to be trapped in that. And that this, I believe, is a really important point when we're looking at the overall power structures of how we live and how things change and justice and injustice. all is wrapped up in this. And as we work with that image of fire, it can be something useful into opening up our deeper relationship with the world. One thing I really love about the Buddha Dharma, particularly the Mahayana, is things are not neatly divided. So difficulties and truths are really inseparable. Now that's a simple thing to say, and I hope it sounds true to you. But a very high bar to actually bring our life to. That the difficulties of life and truths of life are really undividable. If I want to try to live in a whole way, a complete way, truthful way, then difficulty really becomes my path. And this is a little disappointing, if, especially if you come to a spiritual practice hoping some reprieve. But actually there is a reprieve, because the alignment that happens through facing the difficulty is a great relief. It's not the running away in which you're controlled by the difficulty, but you're not aware of it, and you don't know why these difficulties of life keep replicating themselves. But that you face those difficulties so that you can align in a way that the difficulty becomes your teacher. And sometimes those difficulties are simply difficulties of our kind of own manufacture, but oftentimes they are really injustices. And it doesn't mean that the injustice shouldn't be faced, but it means that if we're going to really change the game of the injustice, we have to have the insight to be able to change the game, not simply to react to that injustice. If we're simply reacting, we will eventually replicate. So that the real, if we want to talk about real political efficacy, it comes in a reframing, not in just winning the battle. Oftentimes you don't have the power to reframe if you don't win the battle. So that gets a little tricky in my, study of the politics. So I want to start out with a little bit, this is kind of a central Buddhist framing. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about a rationale, which is not a word that I usually use in any kind of positive sense. I'll get to that later. But what's part of an explanation for why we don't typically engage directly with political discussion as part of a defining characteristic of the path in Buddhism, at least at this temple. Just like rationale is a little bit of a suspicious word, I also think politics is a little bit of a suspicious word, neatly contained. If you want to say, this is something that's problematic, you got to have a good word for it. Where you label it politics, then you can keep it in its place. But let's just engage it here for a moment. I would say that right now, people on the left and those who are in vulnerable or marginalized communities or people, particularly, are feeling angry, afraid. And oftentimes the question that comes from that is, what should we do? What should I do? And that question sometimes gets asked without much differentiation about what's being asked. What should we do sounds like a singular question, like it's just one type of answer. But what I'd like to propose here is there's some importance in looking at different kinds of what should we do's. And the reason is because the standpoints from which they come from are oftentimes very different. So if we're talking about the genre of politics and power, which really is what politics is about, is a balancing of power interests, and it can happen in more democratic ways or in more or less democratic ways. That question typically, those political questions have a standpoint around power. if we're talking about the question of what should we do from a religious or a truth perspective, one of the things that's tricky is that question demands humility. I'll say that again. When you ask from a religious or truth perspective, what should we do? It has to be motivated by humility. If it's not, you can't even take the first step. There's no path to a deeper truth or wisdom or intimate knowledge, understanding, that does not start with humility. In a way, starting from a non-standpoint, to ask that question, you have to kind of start from a non-standpoint. But for those of you who've been struggling with the Lotus Sutra, it's not a non-standpoint that takes a non-standpoint as its mark. Okay? So it's not even a non-standpoint where you say, I am going to have a non-standpoint, because that's a standpoint. Right? If you say, I'm going to not have a standpoint, that's often one of the places that this conversation breaks down, is Buddhists say, no, we have a non-standpoint. No, you can't have a non-standpoint. That's sort of the point of the non. Okay? So, but it gets tricky there, because we're asking this question, what should I do? How do I respond to the world, but how do I respond to this feeling that I have? How do I respond to what's bubbling up through me? That is a very, very important question. And we can't just say, politics is over here and the truth stuff's over here, and never the twain shall meet, right? But oftentimes, again, when we ask that question, we very quickly get turned outward to the what we doing being that direction. Okay? So for the wisdom traditions particularly, not all religious traditions, which I would say the ones that are not informed by intimate knowledge practices have some real problems. Not want to be too, what's called that? Accusatory, polemical. What's the other one when you bag other? Sectarian, yeah. Not with the risk of being too sectarian. I will say that there's some tricks. They have criticisms of us as well, and we go back and forth on that a little bit. But I would say it's interesting to note that within Buddhism in particular, there is no divine right, and there's no mandate of heaven. Now, we could feel very comfortable with that when we're like, yeah, we kicked out the kings and the emperors. Did we? Who are the kings and the emperors of industry, of finance, of certain viewpoints? Who are the kings and emperors of your consciousness? Who are the kings and emperors of your being? And what kind of power do they hold? Those are questions that we need to ask. And part of the reason that Buddhism does not endorse, and historically has not been part of most religious traditions, end up sort of saying, okay, this is how we verify the ruler. And Buddhism has had a different kind of arrangement, which has its own set of problems which I won't go into right now. Okay? But that has been set aside, right? And that kind of division has been maintained. Now, this kind of rationale itself can take us afield very quickly. Wisdom can be reduced to understanding. Wisdom is a living, creative movement of being. And understanding usually is a devolving of that life into a position, into an understanding, into a viewpoint. It's very natural, even necessary, that we have understandings and viewpoints, but this kind of rationale can just leave us in that viewpoint, the standpoint of no standpoint. I believe that right now, one of the big issues that we have is that we're paralyzed by the spectacle. That the flames feel hot. If you were on the political right now, they feel hot in a different way. If you're on the political left right now, they'll feel hot in a different way. If you're a marginalized person, if you're vulnerable, which we all are to some extent, but some people live in much more higher level of vulnerability, then it's going to feel another way. And there's all kinds of, every type of position you might be in, that fire will feel different. But because the spectacle in this kind of very disruptive moment of American politics, not only American, but if we focus on that, this fire is very easily pulled out as a burning world. What I mean by pulled out is we start thinking that the burning world's out there. And so what is burning right here in my own belly is pulled out that direction and projected onto the world. And that's where we get paralyzed there. We get paralyzed in that reverberation. But as I said earlier, this burning world really is our true teacher. And so if you hear me speak again and again about the problems with moral certitude, I would say that's been the number one message I've tried to put forward in the past couple months when it relates to politics. It's not because I think that's the only problem or even the biggest problem, but I do see it's the logjam of more counterculture / liberal communities, which this is we are largely the people who make that up. Generally speaking, I hope that some of you are also not that, but most people who are in Buddhist communities in the West come from that or are influenced by that in some regard. And that logjam I see as a place that's paralyzing us, not because the issues that people have a moral investment in are not important issues, or that we shouldn't be engaging them politically as well as spiritually, but that the kind of the power of the spectacle is a little bit like deer in the headlights situation. Again, the outwardly burning is also inwardly burning. That's what this tradition would always remind us of. And from a Buddhist perspective, the inwardly burning, the inwardly difficult is also the inwardly illuminating. And what we've got to work with is that our recoil or our wanting to feed the flames of that fire, we've got to pay attention to it right here, as well to any other place that we would pay attention to it, because the recoil happens right in the center of our being. It happens through karmic patterns that are largely there for self-preservation. And so especially when we feel afraid, recoiling into those karmic patterns is very natural. Problematic, but also very natural. So we can be kind about that. We can see, yeah, of course we will. But also, what do we want to do? Do we want to just live in that pattern? Do we want to be paralyzed? So my position would be that right here is the work. Right at that place. You know, it's not that we should be thankful for the fire because we want it to happen so that I can do my spiritual work. But guess what? There will be fire. You read history. That's part of the human condition. And in that fire, what are we going to learn? And to come into a very specific relationship with the places where that fire is very alive in myself is really important, because that's where the study of the karma can happen, and that's where truth can be revealed. Notice I'm saying here not just that the karma is undone. Oftentimes that's the way we think of it from a Buddhist perspective, right? If I could find out about that and I could just undo the karma, that would be the solution to the problem. That is a kind of certain type of Buddhism, but actually there's another flavor in Buddhism which says the karma is actually very important for you to come up against the fact of the illumination. And so what it has to teach you is something that will help you discover your own deepest conviction about what your life is about. I'll say that again. It will help you discover what the deepest convictions of your life are about. And that's where really deep meaning comes from. And where the question, what should I do? Or what should we do? That's where we want the response to come from. Not from the simple kind of reactivity that might happen when we feel paralyzed. So the spiritual work can be very political, but political in the sense that if we're going to look for the truths that animate that deep conviction, we need to be in a process of that kind of examination. And I'm focusing here on the kind of inward examination that happens, but that is also the shared examination, particularly within spiritual or religious communities. That's what we're doing all the time. We're talking about what's going on. And what does that have to do with a real way of living that can help me deal with all of the difficulty of my life? You know, like dealing with the difficulty of living is not just about getting rid of the difficulties, right? Dealing with the difficulties of living is learning how to live. And so, like with meditation, for example, there's lots that can happen in terms of overcoming some certain levels of anxiousness or kind of clenching down, rumination, and these kinds of things. And as that happens, which is great, there's a deep medicine in a kind of very simple meditation that's possible there. But it will unveil deeper questions about what is your conviction about living. And so as you're practicing, these things come into you. And if we're to work with these deeper difficulties, again, humility is the absolute entry point. And the humility in the face of very specific things, not a generalized thing. So the medicine in that place of the bodhisattva vow takes on another quality. You know, we chant again and again about the bodhisattva vow. We do it on Sunday mornings. We say, beings are numberless, I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to become it. So I think sounds pretty true, especially if you have a slightly inflated sense of your self-importance, which I know I don't have. Then because it can remain kind of abstract, we need a way that it becomes concrete. And so these kinds of difficulties ask us to tie it back to the own concrete difficulties of our life, which can include what's happening politically or what's happening in the power, the situation, and how will I act in that. I think as we move from the more abstract to the more concrete of the bodhisattva vow, I really like the word invest. You know, think about almost the only way we use that term these days is monetarily. But if you really look at how structures of shared human life are built, they're built through investment in a vision that's really, if they're healthy, that vision is going to be beyond the beings that are doing the seeing. They're not going to be visions of just how do I take care of myself. They're going to be visions about how are beings taken care of. And how are beings taken care of throughout space and throughout time? And how do we invest in those kind of visions continually and comprehensively? To me, becomes the real treasure of this kind of work that I'm trying to point at here. That investment has really strong political ramifications, but it's not located simply within a political response to something or a power response to something. And if you're not so interested in politics, which I'm sure many of you aren't, that's not really where you live, please don't dismiss this all as like, okay, I don't have to really think about that because I'm not so in politics. Because those politics are right here inside of you, whether that's where you hang your hat or not. Whether you're kind of more on the side of politically active or just kind of, I'm trying to not look at it too closely because it seems like I don't understand it and it's too wild or it doesn't seem like relevant to where I'm at. It is relevant to where you're at. But this basic dynamic of not being willing to face it is really alive in all of us. So I believe that next week GK will be talking more about this, something in the realm of this practice, and so we could get into that nitty gritty a little bit. But we have a few minutes if anyone has any questions or things they'd like to bring up in relationship to this.
Let's see. If we, I guess I'm trying to think about something concrete and also something that allows us to kind of explore the concept of moral certitude.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I think about is the incarceration of the Japanese Americans in World War II.
Yeah.
And that while this is going on, the Japanese American, the Buddhist community, one of the places that they turned, both for some understanding of what was happening to them, and also some way to truly, defend themselves, to be able to continue with their beliefs, was to the Constitution, to the First Amendment, freedom of speech and freedom of religion. And the connection between faith and literally an actual living legal political document was couldn't be separated.
Right.
Do you think they were operating out of a sense of moral superiority or certainty, or?
No, I think that that would be an example of exactly what I'm talking about is a kind of process. We're facing that extreme difficulty to find out what is my own conviction about this life, and where do I turn, where do I invest in a vow that goes beyond me, that takes care of me. So in the case of the Japanese American communities that were being incarcerated, one of the things that you didn't see hardly at all was anybody being like, I'm out. This US project is not my project. Mm-hmm. So it's very interesting, because that could have been a response. But the response you see is people developing a deeper certainty about where their investment is going to be, even when the thing they're investing in is putting them in internment camps. And so how do you develop that kind of certainty? That's what I'm pointing at here. That kind of certainty, and certainty, certitude, moral superiority, all those, there's a semantic place in this that can get slippery really quickly. But what I'm taking aim at is the place where we have a standpoint that is not in a continual process of reflection. And I think that we really are in a place where that has become quite strong. That the externalized message about a political position has become its kind of dominant life force. And maybe that's always been the case, but particularly in the media environment that we're in, that is just playing itself again and again and again, and people are taking their eye off the ball, from my perspective.
And again, the ball, I guess, I guess I get confused about a sense of what the Dharma invites us to, and the connection between that, and I kind of brought this up in the past, but and also what the Dharma invites us to, and also what's required in terms of, call it different things, but just for the heck of it, we can call it, for instance, the rule of law.
Yeah.
And if we don't have rules, whether they're instructions to the cook
Right.
or whatever,
Right.
we don't have community.
Right. Exactly.
And so what do we do then when we're faced with what appeared to be the dismantling of the rule of law?
So I think if we're going to go into that on the political side of the discussion, we'd have to get into a very specific thing. And I think I could use as an example of something that I see as the very slippery place. So right now, we look at we could use a term like dismantling of law, or we could say, a lot of people saying, what's on the table is democracy. Are we going to have democracy or not have democracy? I think it's important for us to notice that if you look at the left and the right in the continual political environment, the current political environment, both will make the argument that that's what's on the table.
That's not what the Christian nationalists are saying. The Christian nationalists are not interested in democracy.
Yeah, that may be true,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of right-wing people who do say that it's on the table. That the kinds of things. I mean, I don't believe in. This is not the narrative that I trust. But I also don't exactly trust the left narrative either. But if I were to just be a kind of straw man for the right-wing narrative, I would say that argument is that we have an unelected bureaucracy which will not follow the will of the people and will continue to replicate the agenda of the elites, which are not only the economic elites, but they're the cultural elites, and they've set up a system which is rigged against the working class. And they say there's ample evidence that working class conditions get worse and worse and worse, and that the elites don't care about it, and that the governmental structure and the power structure of media and the power structure of society and finance is all rigged against those people. And so if we actually want to have a democracy, that needs to be shaken up. Okay, so I'm saying that's not, I don't hang my hat there, but that's their argument. So in that situation, if we want to take on an issue of like, what is really democracy, then if we don't do the work that goes this direction equally to the work that goes that direction, we lose our way. That's my main point. And the work that goes this direction has to come through humility. It doesn't have to come through not ever taking a stand on anything, not ever saying, pretty hard to know anything totally and completely, but this looks like it's not good and I need to go some direction. Or to say, we made some rules about how we're going to live together. And if people can't abide by those, there's some limits to that, which have to just bring us to a crisis, which eventually devolves into power, which is always related to violence in some way. And so I think that there is a place where the deeper mind of people is changed. And so if we don't do the internal work, I think that deeper mind doesn't get changed. And that has real political ramifications. So if you look at places where there's movements where things really turn over, the stories that are told, the way that people think about things, all of that has to be transformed. And that is relying on the inner work. And I see that happening but I see it happening all over the place. I think it's not only, it's not something that just one group of people is owning. So I hope that wasn't too complex. or like not in the realm. If I were to pick another very specific place, maybe illustrate this for my, in my own process, could I do that? Go ahead.
Just, I mean, obviously, we can't have this entire conversation here, but,
Yeah.
but I do think that, in a way, I'm kind of hoping that this Dharma talk is actually the beginning of an invitation to create maybe some other forms to continue these explorations, like what is the relationship between Buddhism and democracy? What does the bodhisattva vow look like in terms of a changing situation in terms of our system of government? But I think when you said the thing about, power always devolves into violence, that was the point of democracy, is to kind of find a way where that wasn't how power operated, that we created a different idea and sense of power, where disputes and conflict could be handled in a different way.
Right.
And I think what's interesting about the moment that we're in is we do have a substantial number of people who now are actually not so interested in democracy as in having their way, and actively dismantling those mechanisms which have historically been available to us to address and control the deployment of power through violence.
Yeah. By that, I don't think that just started. And so I think that's one of the places that oftentimes is a kind of a miss for me, is that I don't think, we're in an acute time, but again, that what you're talking about, that process of the dismantling, and again, just now speaking on from my political perspective, I don't think that even close to started with Trump. I don't think it's even close that's where it started. And so that process of what I mean by power always being related to violence in some way is we want to get closer to the minimum amount of violence. And that's what democracy, I believe, has the potential to do, but does not perfectly do, or has not shown itself to be able to do perfectly. And so we have to understand that that violence is not something we can just pretend like won't exist or doesn't exist. We have to pay attention to that. That's what I meant by that comment. But what is the breadth of that conversation about how Buddhism or wisdom traditions would interact with what's our role in society? Locating it simply in the current moment, I think can be a little dangerous, because it tends to bring us towards a more reactive stance. And what I'm advocating here for is a change in vision. And I don't think those two have to be at odds with each other, but where's the center of gravity? I think that's where the functional division that I was bringing up earlier, which has its own problems, is kind of helpful, because we kind of need both. You can't exactly make them two things, but you kind of need them both. In the civil rights movement, for example, you super need James Baldwin. For those of you who are, that's an important era for you. James Baldwin could articulate things in a way that was really different different and similar in some ways to someone like Martin Luther King, for example. And I'm advocating that side of the side of the thing needs to be there.
Can you speak a little bit about the tension between the different kinds of comfort that we get in community and discomforts that we get in community, as it seems like it's more important that people are living in personal solidarity now, that some of the societal privileges that we're losing require us to interact in different ways, and they're not all coming back.
Yeah. So how does what are the advantages then of community. Is that?
Yeah, I guess like the American individuality idea is what a lot of us are kind of grieving, right? I had choices, I had security, right? And then where we are gonna find safety or security is in solidarity now, but that has its own different problems.
Oh yeah.
So if you could sort of speak to like the work and benefit of investing in community.
Right. So that's So how do we invest in community? There's the simple level of it is we've got to show up for each other. And so what are the institutions that I'm involved in my life where community can be built everywhere from family to friends to religious communities I might belong of, school communities I might belong to, other types of political communities I might belong to, and other places. So there's that level of just simply showing up for each other, which is important. I think a place where spiritual traditions have a strong role to play is communities get richer when they share stories, and those stories become a way that they can create meaning. And those stories have to be part of a process of investigating truth. I'm using the word truth here in a kind of very broad, hopefully slightly provocative way. That they can't just be about how do we pat each other on the back or give the circle back rub, which is great, and everything. But that if that's the only thing that binds the community together, even if the only thing that binds the community together is mutual solidarity to face a foe, you end up getting in a funny place. So it needs to be about a continual type of inquiry, and that's what good stories, good myths, good processes of inquiry, etc., that happen communally can lead us through. And I think we're at quite a dearth of that right now. That we have lots of strong assertions, but we don't have that kind of process happening so strongly necessarily. And people pretty fragmented into communities, but then you ask them about their community, and they're like, yeah, I'm on this one chat board or whatever, and you're like, I admit it, to a certain degree it rises to the level of community, but also it's just kind of all externalized. How do I take what I think about this and kind of put it someplace? I'm sure there's some that aren't like that, but I think for the majority of situations are like that. So that process I believe is really important. One thing I would remind you of and other people of is, for example, the Japanese American community. They're not so like, now is the time of the downfall of democracy and we're going to be the targets of it. There's lots of pretty strong support for Trump administration in the Japanese American community, for example. And I'm not saying that to just kind of, I don't know, shake people up or something, but just to say those different communities of people that may be watching out for each other actually feel like the current administration is watching out for them to some degree. And that's hard to swallow for me. And I think it should be hard to swallow, but it's one of those difficulties which I think those communities that are there in support for each other need to face as a process, an introspective community process of swallowing that and digesting it, and not just sort of pretending like it's not there or kind of papering over top of it.
Yeah, I guess I don't mean that like this is a new problem, but I feel like the lack of empathy and the loss of like the idea of beloved community is actually a big, long problem in our culture. But I also, I guess, I'm less worried about the ideology of it than just like the practical discomfort is hard for us.
I think I think you're putting it very well. The practical discomfort of it is exactly where we need to go in my assessment of the situation. That the practical discomfort to be able to sit together and to go through the difficult work of saying, what does it mean to live in community and to take care of each other, and not simply to project that onto the very large scale, although that large scale is important, it impacts us massively, but to take that work on the scale of the actual beings that I'm in contact with there in that community, which we've become less practiced in. The capacity to hear other people, particularly if they have a different opinion, to face difficult human interaction, just to be able to, like, break up with your girlfriend or boyfriend or partner of whatever kind, like in person, for example. That's sort of gone now. Because I was a high school teacher for a long time, and my daughter's high school teacher for a long time, we were always kind of talking about those changes, and everything. It's like, that's a big problem, actually. And it reflects something else that's happening.
What did you say? One thing I was hearing in your talk was distinguishing between moral superiority, senses of moral superiority, and a sense of conviction, moral convictions. Yeah. And how I was hearing you talk about our need to move to this place of cultivating and sharpening and living through that conviction. Yeah. And that has something to do with investment and specificity and embodiment. Yeah. Yep. And that will, those qualities will then inform religious or political activities to be in the flavor of moral conviction building.
Yeah.
Could you say more about that and how we can live in that investigation? Right. And what are the marks of, like, okay, I'm within that, probably humble growth of that power versus a shell of a power that's sidestepping that reflection.
So a perfect example of this would be, if I brought up the specific thing that I've been most involved in when it comes to this intersection, is racial justice and white supremacy. There's this way in which people can cultivate this whole kind of lingo and particular ways of looking at race and privilege and power. That's kind of like, okay, I read the right books, and I started emulating the language correctly, and I don't say black anymore. I say something else, or whatever it is, and that becomes where it operates. Now, does that level important? Certainly it is. The way we express something is important, but it's very easy for us to abstract what's good or right, take the burning sensation, put it onto the problem, grab what's the right way to do it, and then to enforce that on myself and others as a way of not actually ever having to deal with anybody that's not the same race as me. And that function is so deeply ingrained in us that we do that quite naturally. So what's the difference between that and actually, like, not trying to go make friends who aren't white for the purposes of whatever? That's not quite right either. But how do you actually reflect on what it is to be in a society that is multiracial and is racialized? And what is the, I would say, necessarily spiritual inquiry that is going to emerge from that investigation? If we don't do that, then all the ways we may come to respond to racial injustice won't be, they're just caught in that dichotomy, and then just going to replicate themselves. And I think, we see a lot of problems in that, in that regard. And so for me personally, or I think about the investment that I have in my family, for example, my wife's Japanese, and so my family's multiracial. I had to find how to get out how to get inside of that very specific and deep work that also contains a whole bunch of anger about how we may be seen and how we may be treated, to be able to then respond on this higher level. And on this, by higher level, I don't mean superior level. I mean the level of what words am I going to use? How are we going to engage each other publicly? So I think that same process is really alive in anything that we want to do. And as we go more deeply into it, what we find is a problem that can't really be defined by the power dynamics of the politics. That it will be related to it, but it will be more fundamental to that. So, for example, in the case of racial justice issues, one of the things you will come up against if you go more deeply into that is that we all humans are humans, and we're all, in one sense, completely worthy of the same respect and love as any other human. That sounds pretty good. Regardless of conditions, that's true. That very quickly erases people's specific conditional existence, which includes their race. And so once you get down to that point and you see love sees no color, that place, that then immediately starts erasing all of these people. And we saw that dynamic play out when people through a process socially. And so that would be an example of that more deeper thing you have to deal with is going to challenge you in a way that's beyond really what you can hold just rationally. That the multiplicity of being and this universality of being will always come into play somewhere, and we won't be able to think our way through it. We have to actually live our way through it.
I'm hearing or I'm feeling into the teachings of the 5 eyes of the Tathagata, how you can meet the specificity of something and hold kind of things beyond that.
Yeah.
And I think that overlays and enters this political situation as like, oh, I feel problem.
Yeah.
Okay, I have to meet problem, but I have to hold something beyond problem.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
All while being lively and responsive.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, we better stop at some point, and like Carl said, let this be the opening of a conversation as opposed to the closing. And I thank you all for engaging.